coming. My name is Dalene. I'm the curatorial assistant here at Guildhall. I've been here a little over a year, and this is my first curatorial endeavor. And it's been a thrill working with Sara Mejia Kriendler on this exhibition. I think it came together really, really nicely. I wanted to thank Sara for all this beautiful work, most of it new and unique to this exhibition. I also wanted to thank her father, John. He needs to add art handler to his resume. And for everyone for being here. I guess we're the only people that are not at Art Basel, which is great. Sara received her bachelor's at the University of Pennsylvania and her master's from the School of Visual Arts. She now resides in Brooklyn and also comes to the Hamptons pretty regularly. Her parents live full-time in Sagaponic. She made most of the work in her studio in Sagaponic. This exhibition was honored as part of her award. She received top honors in our 2016 Artist Members exhibition, it was juried by Jia Jia Fei of the Brooklyn Museum.
She was at the Guggenheim and then at the Jewish Museum.
Jewish Museum, excuse me. So that was amazing. Everything, like I said, that you see is new and made specifically for this exhibition. It's based on a previous body of work that she most recently exhibited in Pereira, the Museo de Arte de Pereira in Pereira, Colombia. We're so thrilled to have her work here. This exhibition will be up through December 16th. So spread the word if anyone hasn't seen it yet. So all three shows are really incredible. I'll now turn it over to Sara to elaborate further, and she's going to talk a little bit about her work, and then definitely save your questions and comments for after that.
All right. So thank you all for coming, and a big thank you to Casey. It was really amazing to work with her. And my dad, who is here, who did much more than art handling. He also, fed me and let me work in his garage, so that counted for a lot. So I'm going to talk about this exhibition, and we can do questions afterwards, but if you want to interrupt me at any time with a burning question, also feel free to do that. So Tolstoy said that all great literature is one of two stories. It is either a man goes on a journey or a stranger comes to town. So this exhibition is very much the former. A man goes on a journey, except in this case it's a woman. So that's where I wanted to start. And this journey for me really started with a trip that I took to Colombia. So my mother is Colombian, and I got to spend a lot of time there as a child, and they call it the land of magical realism, for a reason. It was a really magical time for me. But then my parents moved to Europe, and Colombia became, very dangerous for a time, so I wasn't able to return for over 20 years. And this exhibition really came from my return there, so it is kind of a homecoming story and what that homecoming inspired. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So it's interesting that when we talk about art, we speak about bodies of work. We talk about bodies of work, and I'm really not sure where that expression comes from, but I should probably investigate and find out how it started. But I think it's particularly relevant to this exhibition because, as you may notice, there are a lot of body parts here. So I'm going to try and talk about each work specifically, but also talk about it as, a part of the body, and see how that all comes together. So the first one I'm going to speak about is this piece here. It is called Nova. And I really wanted to include this work in the exhibition because it is how I won this exhibition. Not this work specifically, but a similar work I exhibited in the annual members exhibition. And it's how I won. So I wanted to pay tribute to that because I'm grateful to it. So this is a styrofoam. It's made from styrofoam. So I'm going to explain the process a little bit. I'm going to be talking a lot about mold making, which is kind of complicated because it goes back and forth between positive and negative. So it's a little bit confusing if you don't haven't actually done it yourself. But this work also speaks to where I was coming from before my trip to Colombia, so it's a good place to start. So this is made from styrofoam, and I started collecting styrofoam when I moved to New York for graduate school. One of the things that really struck me about New York was the trash. It was really heartbreaking to see just how much garbage there was everywhere. I'd never seen garbage on such an epic scale. And I think partially out of just the desire to save these things from the landfill, I started to collect styrofoam. My friends also started to collect styrofoam for me. There are a number of you here, and I'm grateful for all of your hard work. But I can't collect anymore because it's embarrassing how much I have. So I started to work with styrofoam. I also thought it was a really interesting contemporary material to be using just because it spoke a lot to the times. You know, it's light, it's cheap, it enables consumption on this kind of epic scale. It's not biodegradable, it's going back into the earth, and really it's toxic. So that's one reason why I was collecting it. I also found it strangely beautiful. So it was kind of these two sides to the material that really attracted me to it. So for a long time, styrofoam was my main material. So this is a relief sculpture. So I took a sheet of styrofoam and then I carved into the sheet. So it's an interesting way of working because you're actually working backwards. You know, I'm not seeing the marks that I'm making as I'm carving. So I kind of have to imagine how it's going to turn out. So the hard part about that is that there are a lot of failures along the way. You know, you have to scrap a lot of them because you think you've done something interesting and then you make it and it's really not so good. But the fun part is the surprise. It's always a surprise because you pour the plaster onto the styrofoam, then you peel the styrofoam away, and this is what is left. So it's plaster, but it has, you know, the texture of styrofoam. So it's kind of like opening a present, and that's very exciting to see, you know, what happens. And this work, you know, more than some of the others, is really about mark making. And I think as an artist, it's really interesting. You know, we think a lot about mark making and about what we're leaving behind. And there's a German writer, theorist, who said that a civilization's most telling and illuminating artifacts are not its high culture, but its disposable and throwaway creations. And this quote has always really spoken to me. Because I think as artists, we think about the marks that we're making, and I think it's just more important than ever to really think as humans and as a society about the marks that we're making, you know, especially on this planet. So this styrofoam landscape is really, for me, about, you know, speaking about kind of that legacy and, you know, thinking about that. So this is kind of the brains of the exhibition, as I like to call it, or the head. Here. So if this is kind of the brains of the exhibition, I would say that, you know, this work here is the body, kind of the guts. So this piece, these are kind of idols or icons, and they really speak to my interest in art that is sacred. And you know, if you look at the history of art, we've been making art for, you know, what, let's say 40,000 years, more than 40,000 years. If you look at the history of art, most of art has been about, you know, worship and about something sacred. So it's only really recently that the role of art has started to change. So for most of art history, you know, worship and the sacred qualities of art were really inseparable. And that's something that I've always been really interested in. You know, I love going to the Met. I love seeing these magical works of art. You know, they literally were thought to have magical powers, and I'm really interested in that kind of power. I think, you know, contemporary art has moved in kind of a different direction. It's very interesting, but at some point, art became less about the sacred and more about, you know, challenging the status quo, or about critiquing society, or about self-expression, or about, you know, breaking the mold. So there's these two sides to the artistic kind of impulse. The one being, you know, the sacred, the desire to glorify to kind of build the myth. You know, that type of work is really about mythology. And then I think a lot of contemporary art is more about kind of breaking down mythology and kind of poking holes. So those are the two roles that I'm kind of interested, the secular and the sacred, and it's something that I really struggle with. And this is really where those works kind of came from. You know, is my job to create idols or to kind of tear down false idols? But the great thing about art, and I think my favorite works of art today are the ones that kind of manage to do both at the same time. And that's really what I was kind of thinking about when I was making these works, is how can I, you know, plug some holes, but also kind of poke holes at the same time. So that's where these works started for me, with this kind of conflict. So these are female figures, and I was having a show in 2015 at a gallery in Brooklyn called AIR Gallery. And it is a gallery that's dedicated to showing the work of female artists, women artists. So it's at this time that I started to use the female figure, because I was thinking a lot more about what it was to be a woman and a woman artist. And I really wanted to address that. So I started using these female figures. I started using Barbie doll packaging to make figures. I started using Wonder Woman. And I started using this mannequin. So this is kind of a recurring motif, one of my protagonists, as I like to call them. So to make this work, really, it started as a mold. So I had this shape that you see indented was actually the positive. It was the actual, you know, mannequin. And I wanted to take this plastic, disposable dollar store mannequin and make it in clay. So in order to do that, you have to make a mold. So this is actually the mold. And the interesting thing, or one of the exciting things about being an artist, is that you have a plan, but you can deviate from your plan at any point in time when a wonderful accident happens that is more interesting than where you were going. So that's exactly what happened in this work. I was intending to take this mold and produce a terracotta piece out of it. But when I cast the sculpture, the mold was actually a lot more interesting to me than the piece that I was going to produce. So that was very exciting. And you know, mold making is really an important part of my work. And I think it's just like everything that we consume, really, that isn't made by hand most likely came out of a mold. So like this technology, it's a very ancient technology, but we've taken it to these kind of epic proportions. But everything you're buying is probably coming out of some kind of mold. Like toilets are made like this. They have this plaster thing. They fill it with liquid clay, and then out pops the toilet. So I thought it was really relevant to make the mold the sculpture, to really talk about that process. And so that's where this work came from. And it's interesting to me because people always ask me if this is me, like if this came from my body, and I'm not really sure whether I should be flattered or terrified. Because, I mean, clearly it's augmented in all the right places and minimized in all the right places. But it really does speak to also, the woman's body and, how that is being manipulated. So because people kept asking me whether it was me, in my head I started to call this sculpture The Better Versions of Me. So that was kind of the working title. But the other accident that happened while I was producing this work was after I'd made the mold, I decided, okay, this is more interesting than the sculpture I'm going to make. But I still wanted to try and see what happened when I made it in, terracotta. So I poured clay into this cavity because that's how you would produce the terracotta. You pour clay in, you wait for it to harden, then you take out the clay, and that is the result. Well, I wasn't expecting, what I wasn't expecting to happen at all. I knew there would be some kind of staining, but I didn't know that it would leave these really intricate marks, this pattern and these kind of veins. And that was absolutely, so exciting for me. It was the most exciting part of the process. And this work is actually called The Last Word because the clay or the earth is what has the last word. And I think it's another really interesting part of the process because I'm not fully in control of how this work is going to turn out. And I think as an artist, that's really interesting, when you're thinking about artistic agency and when you're thinking about, how much control you have and what your power is. I really liked that I was giving the power of finishing the work back to the earth as opposed to myself. And also just the element of surprise and seeing, what kind of nature and this natural process was going to do. So it's called The Last Word because the earth literally finishes the work and, ultimately the earth will always have the last word. So I really wanted to pay tribute to that. So that is, the guts of the exhibition. And then I want to move over to this piece over here. And this work is really where, the story about Colombia is going to, come back more into play here. So not only did I get to go back to Colombia, but I also had the amazing opportunity to have an exhibition there. And so that's really where all of this work started for me. So I was having this exhibition in Colombia, and I knew that I didn't want to just bring the work that I was making in New York to Colombia. Like as I did with this exhibition, and as I generally do, I always like to respond really site-specifically to each place. Like as an artist, you're kind of very sensitive to your surroundings, and I feel like that is my job really, to kind of respond very specifically to each place. So I turned to history as my, starting point to see what I was going to do for this exhibition. And before becoming an artist, I actually studied history and briefly considered a career in academia, but I like playing with mud and making stuff with my hands way too much to sit around and write papers, so I became an artist instead. But history does really continue to inspire me and play a big, role in my work. And I find myself more and more attached to history these days. We live in this crazy time where it's all about progress and change and the future. And I think that's really important. There's a lot of things that we need to change, obviously. And I certainly do not advocate for going back, but I am really interested in looking back. And I think that's partially where the title of the exhibition came from, In Back of Beyond. Just because there is a lot to learn from history, and if we forget about it, I just feel like we're gonna make the same mistakes over again. And so that was something I was really thinking about, the number of talks that you go to now where people are all about changing the world and the future. It's a little bit frightening for me at times, I have to say, because I do have a great respect for history. So that's where this work started. History. So in the second grade, I had to write my first paper. And the topic was, I was going to an international school, so the topic was, where are you from? And you had to write a paper about where are you from. So I chose Colombia because I was in Belgium and I loved Colombia. So, I started doing research with my mom and, cutting out the flag and drawing the map and looking at parts of Colombia that I wanted to write this, paper about. And so one thing that I really remembered was the flag, and my mother explaining to me what the Colombian flag meant. So the top half of the Colombian flag is all yellow. Then there is a band of blue and then a band of red. And so the story that she told to me was that the yellow was to represent, the yellow was, most of it, half of the flag, twice the other strips, because it represented the riches and the gold that came from Colombia. And then the blue was for the two oceans, because Colombia has both the Pacific and the Atlantic coast. And then the red was for the bloodshed in the independence. So I knew that I wanted to talk about gold just from that, first story, because it was something that had stuck with me. So I started researching, pre-Columbian gold, and that's really where this exhibition started. And also I'd seen a lot of contemporary art when I was, in Colombia. And this kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier about, art that is about honoring something versus about criticizing. And a lot of the work that I saw in Colombia was really political, really biting, really critical, and deservedly so. Like, there's a lot to critique, and there's a lot there that artists need to address, and I think that that's really important, but it's just not where I was personally coming from. I wanted to come more from a place of like honoring something or loving something. And also, as a Colombian living in the United States, it's really heartbreaking because you tell people, I'm from Colombia, and you hear about narcos, and you hear about, just a legacy that is obviously part of the country. But I just wanted to bring in another part of the story. I just didn't want to talk about that. I wanted to talk about something else, something really beautiful. So that's why I started to look at, pre-Columbian gold work. And it's interesting because it's also a part of art history that really gets glazed over. Like, the amount of time that I spent learning about Egyptian art is astounding, but pre-Columbian art is so sophisticated and so beautiful, and it's just not given the attention that it deserves. So I wanted to give it, attention. So I started researching pre-Columbian gold, and learning about how beautiful and sophisticated it was. And I'm just going to read a quote here. Some of the pre-Columbian gold, a lot of it was melted down, so people in Europe really didn't get to see a lot of it. But some of it did actually, make it back to Europe. And Albrecht Dürer, who was a really well-known engraver and an artist that I also love, he had the opportunity to see some of this work, and this is what he had to say about it. He was the son of a goldsmith, so he happened to see the treasures, and he could really appreciate them because he knew about the process. So he said, "Never in all of my life have I seen things that delighted my heart as much as these, for I saw among these amazing artistic objects, and I marveled at the subtle ingenuity of the people of those distant lands." And really, that's how I felt when I was looking at this work, because it was just so sophisticated. They were far more advanced in their gold working than the Europeans were. And so that is how kind of this piece started, looking at pre-Columbian gold work. Unfortunately, the more I continued to read about this history, the darker the story became. Because once you start, when you're reading about, pre-Columbian gold, and you're reading about, how the indigenous people felt about gold, it's really a beautiful story. It was this magical material for them. It was, supernatural. It was connected to the gods and connected to the sun. And, that is kind of the glorious side of gold. And gold is this really kind of cosmic and magical material. So that was, one side of the story. But when you start reading about, the conquests, like, the story becomes extremely dark and extremely heartbreaking. So even though this work started from this place of I want to do something positive, I just couldn't ignore the dark story that started to emerge. So, this work also talks about that, kind of the ugly side, the greedy side, the murderous side of what gold inspired. So this work is called El Dorado because the legend of El Dorado is from Colombia, and it is really what, inspired this story that I'm going to tell you. So El Dorado means the golden one because there was this legend that the Spaniards started to I mean, nobody knows whether it's really true or whether they just fabricate it, but either way, in around 1540, the Spaniards in the New World started talking and looking for El Dorado. And the story was that there was a chieftain, the head of this tribe in Colombia, that, lived in a place where there was so much gold that every day the chieftain would wake up and cover his body in gold dust. And that's all he wore. He didn't have armor. Like, his attire was this golden dust. And then every day he would wash it off and start over again. So there was so much gold that he could do this all the days of the year. And then the other side of the story that they started to hear was that this chieftain, as part of this elaborate ritual, would go out on a raft in the middle of a lake. And this raft would be loaded up with gold and loaded up with emeralds, and that he would then dump all of that into the lake as kind of an offering to the gods. So, it's really such a beautiful idea. Like, there is some evidence that this ritual did actually occur. And it's such a beautiful idea because it was this idea of taking this raw material from the earth, forming it into this really exquisite works of art, and then kind of giving it back to the earth. And it was just such like a humble gesture. But all the Spaniards could think about was, there's a lake somewhere that's full of gold and we need to find it. So, as I started reading about the history, it was just the story of how many people died on this quest. Like, not just the indigenous people that they killed, but the Spaniards themselves. I mean, so many of them, they were in this really harsh landscape trying to find this city of gold. At some point, they were so hungry that they were eating the leather on the soles of their shoes as food to try and sustain themselves. So it was really, a very dark story. So this piece for me, I say, is about what it means to look for something but not to see. And it's about blindness in a way. And it's also, it has a memorial quality for me. Like, I was just thinking so much about all these lives that were lost. And so it was a little bit haunting to make this work because I had these empty eyes looking back at me for a number of months. So I guess, as I was saying before, I started from a place of wanting to talk about pre-Columbian gold and really honoring that, but I ended up in kind of a darker story. And F. Scott Fitzgerald said that the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. And I think this is a really interesting quote in terms of talking about all these different conflicts that I've been addressing, because in my life, I do not feel capable of doing this at all. But I think what's great about art is that it can do both things at the same time. And as I said before, I really do think that the best works are able to do both things at the same time and kind of bring those conflicts, together. And I think that's kind of how we deal with those things. So that's really, where this work came from for me. And I also was really interested in bringing this piece out here to the Hamptons because I think this story of this pursuit is something that is still very relevant today and, especially here. I'm going to talk about one more piece, maybe end on a slightly more cheery note. So this is, this work here these are terracotta. Both of these are made with terracotta, so it kind of relates also to the works that I talked about earlier. And this is another kind of change that my trip to Colombia really inspired. I hadn't really worked with red clay before, but there's another anecdote, which is, so a lot of the pre-Columbian gold that was discovered, the Spaniards didn't care about the artistic value. They literally just wanted the material. So they didn't see the beauty or the artistry. They were just like gold. So they melted most of it down in the New World into gold bars or ingots to be shipped back. And the really bizarre thing is that they would take a lot of this gold that had been used for ritual in one way, and then they would use it in their own churches and in their own rituals. So it was just such a disturbing thing to think that you could be in a church in Europe and that gold was melted down from, you know, somebody else's sacred work. But there's this anecdote that, you know, one of the indigenous people saw the Spaniards melting down the gold, and they just said, you know, why on earth would you do that? An unworked piece of gold is worth the same as a lump of clay. Because for them, it was really not, I mean, the gold itself was a magical material, but it was more about their transformation of this material. So I wanted to use clay also in the work to talk about the earth, but also to talk about this relationship between kind of the earthen and the otherworldly, and to really question the value of these things. Like, why do we value these things, you know, so differently? So this piece, this bowl here, is really about inspiration. So, you know, I've tried to get a little bit in this talk at, you know, where it all comes from, where this all comes from. Like, I don't really think it's my job to figure out what it means, but I do think it's important to think about, you know, where it comes from. And so this work is about inspiration. As much as I've talked about it today, it's all really a mystery as an artist about where we get these ideas and how it all happens. And this work is called Inner Visions, because one of the magical things about being an artist is that you do have inner visions. You see pictures inside of your head, and you know, that's so exciting. Like, the really exciting part about being an artist is that you see ideas or pictures in your head, and then you actually get to make them real. So I really think that is, you know, the magic of art for me, and I feel like I get to make dreams come true in this very strange way. And so that is really what this work is about. It's addressing that. And, you know, I think it's interesting if I think about, you know, this piece being about blindness, or what it means to look but not to see. I think this work for me is really about what it means to see clearly. And so in some ways, I would say it's kind of the heart of the exhibition. And so I think I will end there. So yeah, if anybody has any other questions, you know, I will say that actually I didn't really speak specifically about this piece, but this is where I'm going next. So this is this pile of kind of broken hands. I wanted to end on a light note, so I didn't, you know, want to talk too much about that.
I'm glad you went back to that.
But
because I was,
yeah, yeah. But I'm going back because it's what I'm working on for my next exhibition. I'm going to be having a show in Brooklyn next at a wonderful gallery called The Chimney. And so right now I'm working on making a ton of these, you know, broken hands. So that's where I'm going next. But yeah.
I have a question for you. What's
Okay.
underneath the gold leaf? What's the base material?
Okay, so this is actually not gold leaf, it's gold foil. So the same material that like a candy bar comes wrapped in is how I made this. So it started as little tiny candy wrappers. There is no base underneath it. It is actually made entirely out of gold foil. So it's very fragile. It's very strong, but it's also very fragile, but it is 100% gold foil. There's nothing behind it.
Did you work it over a form?
So I had a form, I had these masks, these plaster masks. So it's also this mold making process that goes back and forth. So I had plaster masks, and I would take these big sheets of gold foil, and then I would work them over the form and kind of emboss them. And you know, it's a traditional gold working technique that people do with real gold, but you know, I did it with gold foil. So it's something that kids do in school. I also really like, you know, artistic techniques that are kind of available to anyone. Like every kid has taken a piece of foil and kind of conformed it to some object. So I did that, and then I took the foil off of the form and left just the foil. So, yeah.
This is
very beautiful piece, and it looks very delicate. It's very long. Is it one piece?
It is one piece.
Wow, how do you transport that?
It was 4 pieces when it arrived at the museum. It became one piece here.
So what happens now?
Yeah.
That's a very good question. Do you have an 18-foot truck? Because I'm looking for one.
You have 10 days to figure that out.
Yes, I have 10 days to figure it out. I was worried more about the talk, and then I'll focus on the next.
Go on a surf rack.
Oh no, I don't think so. Yes.
Yeah, I was curious about the bowls I asked before. I thought it was pottery. But,
No, they're actually made out of concrete. I wanted to have a color contrast also. I didn't want to, I like to use construction material a lot. So plaster is this very basic construction material. So I really wanted to use, concrete and, some basic construction material to make these bowls. And I also really liked the color, the contrast between kind of the warm terracotta and then this kind of cooler, blue material. So they're made out of concrete. But I was really thinking about, they're kind of offerings. I wanted them to have the feeling of these kind of offerings. So that's kind of where the shape came from.
the mold?
They were molded around an object. But yeah, they're fabricated concrete. So, yes.
I have another question.
Okay.
Conceptual question.
Yes.
Not a technical one.
Okay.
So this piece is in honor of pre-Columbian art, gold, that tradition, and you have picked a sequence of masks that you made or were they found?
Mm-hmm.
They, to me, seem to be in the style of Venetian masks.
Mm-hmm.
Was that a conscious thing?
That was something that, I was looking at, pre-Columbian masks, death masks. So that was not a conscious thing. This was more, conceptually, I was thinking more about the faces as bricks. So I started with, a mask, but I really wanted them to feel like bricks, and I wanted to build what felt like a wall. So I wasn't specifically thinking about Venetian masks, but I was thinking just about turning them into bricks that would be part of this architecture. I wanted them to become almost architecture.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up that it's from death masks.
Yes.
Also.
Or ritual masks. They made, really beautiful masks that you were supposed to be buried in. Gold has always had this connection to immortality and the eternal. So that's really where they came from. Yes.
What do you see as the next steps in the evolution of your art?
Well, I'm working on these golden hands for the exhibition. And these terracotta hands for the exhibition. So I really want to continue with this body of work. I think, when I was a younger artist or when I was first starting out, the jumps that I was making were kind of bigger, these bigger leaps. But sometimes you feel like in your work, like you really hit, a note that you want to keep varying. So I think for now I'm really interested in seeing where I can continue to take these works as opposed to like completely innovating. And it was really interesting because speaking back to what I was mentioning about history, I was listening to this talk by this fascinating artist named Wolfgang Leib. And he has been making this one work of art for like 30 years, He's this amazing artist, and he collects pollen from, different trees, and then he makes these beautiful paintings. It takes him months and months and months to collect this pollen. And then he makes these beautiful paintings on the floor with just pollen. And he was talking about how in an age that's so obsessed with innovation and change and making new things, and as artists you feel that pressure, like, okay, I need to make something new, I need to make something new. He was saying, I love that I'm going to keep making this exact same work And I think that that is radical. So I'm a little bit inspired by that. I don't think I have his level of maybe obsession to one idea, and he's done other things, but I think for now I want to try and just continue to see how far I can take these ideas before jumping to something totally new. But I'm going to work on the hands, and that will probably be new. So I don't know. You can't really control it. You're an artist. Stuff happens. And then you look back and you're like, what happened?
And why hands?
Well, the handmade is another one of those conflicts. I didn't really address it so much in the talk, but I think in my work I'm very interested in that. You know, mold making, what is made in a mold, what is made by hand. And I think the question as an artist for the hand is so important. I mean, the oldest art is literally hands on a wall. Like, that's where it started. So now that we're moving into this digital age where everything is on a screen, I think I'm more interested than ever in talking about the human hand. But it's also really a symbol of labor for me. Like, my work is very labor intensive, and I really respect labor. So I think it's also going to speak a lot about labor, and it's something that I'm thinking about. So that's why I'm interested in the earthen hand. But it's also, you know, a mass-produced hand, so it has kind of that conflict in there that I was talking about. So hopefully it'll do both at the same time.
I
Yes.
see a lot of your work is really following intended and unintended results and letting them happen. So that, to me, anyway, there's always that value causality factor. The more you look, the more things play. Because even in your wall piece, you're getting the positive vibes, but you're also getting the negative vibes.
Yes.
And playing with where you're molding, you're getting a positive hand, but it's not a real.
Yes.
And with the gold being melted down, gold is real. It has a value, but what is the value? That chain of changes.
Mm-hmm.
So it all seems, I don't know if you feel it in that kind of journey, but it visually imprints on me in that kind of journey. You know what it is?
I mean, yeah, that's such a great comment, because I mean, that is really one of the fun things about being an artist, is that, you know, I'm discovering all of this as I'm making it. You know, people ask you a lot about like what it means or what it is, and you know, I'm figuring it out too. Like, I don't know. I mean, as much as I envision these things in my mind before I put them out there, once they're there, it's something else. And then I also have to, you know, I didn't know that the positive, what you said is true, and I mean, a lot of people have mentioned that, and I had no idea that that was going to happen. So that's kind of part of the magic of it, is that those things happen, and then you make another step based on that information, and it's part of the fun, really. There's not so many other professions maybe where you get to just play like that and
learn so much always.
yeah, not be in control of everything that's happening.
It makes me think of an earlier exhibit where you, I don't remember the full title, but it had Anthropocene. Is that a theme that cuts across your work?
Yeah, I really didn't talk about that so much today, but it is definitely a theme that cuts across. So the Anthropocene is, for those of you who don't know about it, is this term that geologists came up with that talks about how our impact on the planet is so great that we're actually in a new geological era. And it's something that geologists are arguing about. And I think it goes back to this mark-making issue of, you know, the marks that we're making on the earth. And that is really a big concern for me. And I think it is in this exhibition. I think I looked more kind of at the origins of that. Like in the other exhibitions I've had, it was talking more about how that idea is playing out now in the, you know, in the world. I think this exhibition was more about looking back to like, how did this all start? So I think that's why I was so interested in this kind of story of kind of greed, because I mean, I think that's really how we've gotten here. So I think it's more of like the origin story in a way of like how did we start down this path? But so it's in the work here too, and I'm sure it'll continue to find its way back in. Yeah, and I just wanted to say a big thank you again to Guildhall and to Casey